April 23, 1945. Somewhere east of the Elbe River. Hans Dietrich couldn't feel his left leg anymore. The shrapnel had torn through his thigh 3 hours earlier, or was it 4? And now he lay in the mud-churned ditch, watching American soldiers move through the trees like cautious ghosts. At 22, he had been taught that capture meant torture, execution, the vengeful fury of the Anglo-Saxon devils his officers had described in those final, desperate briefings. His Hitler youth training had been explicit. Better to die than fall into enemy hands. But dying was taking too long. The blood had soaked through his makeshift tourniquet. A belt, the leather still bearing his father's initials, and the world was acquiring that strange, crystalline quality that comes just before consciousness fails. He tried to reach for the sidearm still holstered at his hip, but his fingers wouldn't obey. Then boots. American boots, inches from his face. Brown leather, still impossibly clean despite the filth of the forest floor. Hans waited for the bullet. Instead, he heard a voice, calm, almost bored, calling in English. "Medic! We got a live one here." What happened in the next 6 minutes would replay in Hans Dietrich's mind for the next 60 years. A loop of incomprehension that never quite resolved into understanding. Hands, gentle hands, cut away his trousers. An injection, sharp and quick. A pressure bandage applied with practiced efficiency. Then a stretcher, and the bizarre sensation of being carried by the enemy with the same careful urgency he'd seen German medics use for their own wounded. "You're gonna be okay, buddy," someone said in broken German. "Just hang on, buddy." The word hung in the air like smoke. The Anglo-Saxon devil had just called him buddy. In the spring of 1945, Germany existed in a state beyond mere defeat. It had entered a realm of existential paralysis, a twilight zone between the world that propaganda had promised and the smoking ruins of what remained. 363,000 German soldiers had died in the final 4 months of the war. 11 million were now prisoners. The cities were landscapes of broken stone and twisted metal. Hamburg reduced to 38% of its pre-war housing, Cologne to 24%, Berlin to barely a third. 7 million Germans were homeless. Food rations in the British zone had fallen to 1,000 calories per day. Half what a laborer needs to survive, and everywhere the expectation. Now comes the reckoning, now comes the revenge. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Germans had seen what happened after the First World War. The Versailles humiliation, the impossible reparations, the French occupation of the Ruhr, the hyperinflation that turned life savings into worthless paper. They had been raised on stories of the starvation blockade that continued months after the armistice, killing hundreds of thousands. They had been taught correctly that victors extract payment from the defeated. That was the natural order of things, the logic of history. The Morgenthau Plan, leaked and widely discussed, seemed to confirm their worst fears. The American Secretary of Treasury had proposed converting Germany into a pastoral nation, stripping away its industrial capacity, reducing it to an agricultural economy that could never again threaten its neighbors. It was, essentially, a plan for permanent poverty, for the systematic dismantling of everything that had made Germany Germany. In Hans Dietrich's village in Thuringia, where he would return 9 months after his capture, people whispered about what was coming. They buried valuables. They prepared for starvation. His mother had already lost 2 sons to the Eastern Front. She expected to lose the third to occupation, one way or another. Nobody expected mercy. Mercy was for fairy tales. Field Hospital, number 47, American Third Army, April 23, 1945. Hans woke on a table. Bright lights. The chemical smell of ether and antiseptic. His leg was bare, cleaned. impossibly clean given where he'd been an hour ago. A surgeon, he could tell by the steady hands, the focused eyes above the surgical mask, was preparing instruments. Another man was checking his pulse. "He's coming around," someone said. The surgeon looked down at him. Blue eyes, tired blue eyes. "Hello there," he said in German, the accent American but comprehensible. "I'm Dr. Morrison. We're going to fix your leg, you understand." Hans tried to speak. His throat was dust. "Don't talk," Morrison said. "Just listen. You've got shrapnel fragments in your femoral artery. If we don't remove them, you'll lose the leg, maybe more. But the surgery is tricky. I need you to stay very still. Can you do that?" Hans managed a nod. His mind was struggling to process what was happening. Where was the line? In German field hospitals, even German wounded had to wait sometimes for hours, days, depending on the priority. And here he was, an enemy soldier, going straight to surgery. No waiting, no interrogation, just treatment. "Good man," Morrison said. He turned to someone Hans couldn't see. "Let's put him under. Carefully. He's lost a lot of blood." The mask came down over his face. Hans's last conscious thought before the anesthetic took him was absurdly domestic. The surgeon's hands were manicured. Not a metaphor, actually manicured. Clean nails, careful cuticles. This man, this enemy, took care of his hands like they were instruments of precision. Which, of course, they were. The surgery took 2 hours and 43 minutes. Morrison removed 14 pieces of shrapnel, repaired the damaged artery, using a technique he'd learned at Johns Hopkins before the war, and sutured the wounds with the kind of meticulous care that suggested he saw no difference between this leg and any other leg that had come through his operating theater. When Hans woke again, it was dark. He was in a tent with perhaps 30 other men, most of them asleep or sedated. Some were American, some were German. They lay side by side, separated only by the width of a cot. His leg hurt, a fierce, clean pain that somehow felt like proof of life. He could wiggle his toes. That seemed miraculous. "Water?" A voice, soft, American. Hans turned his head. A young soldier, arm in a sling, was holding out a canteen. He couldn't have been more than 19. "Danke," Hans whispered. The American helped him drink. The water was cold, clean, possibly the most delicious thing Hans had ever tasted. "You were screaming earlier," the American said conversationally, his German surprisingly good. "In the surgery. In German, I mean. Something about your mother." Hans felt heat rise in his face. Shame, confusion, gratitude all tangled together. "It's okay," the American continued. "I called for my mom too when they set my arm. I'm from Wisconsin, farm country. We got a dairy operation. What about you?" And there it was, the second impossible thing. The enemy wanted to know about his life. Not his unit, not his orders, not military intelligence. Just him, who he was, where he came from. "Thuringia," Hans managed. "My father was a teacher. Was dead. 1943. Eastern Front." The American nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. Sorry." The Anglo-Saxon devil was sorry about his father. Hans closed his eyes. Nothing made sense anymore. The entire architecture of his understanding, the framework of us and them, victor and vanquished, righteous revenge and deserved punishment, was cracking, fissure by fissure, under the weight of reality. The Marshall Plan, announced formally on June 5, 1947, didn't arrive with fanfare in most German towns. It arrived in increments, in small acts of reconstruction that seemed almost deliberately anti-dramatic. A shipment of coal, new rail ties, industrial equipment sold on generous credit terms, food aid that meant rations could increase from 1,100 calories to 1,500, then to 1,800. For the generation that lived through it, the Trummer generation, the Rubble generation, the Marshall Plan wasn't experienced as policy. It was experienced as a reversal of the natural order, a betrayal of everything they'd been taught about power and punishment. Consider the numbers: $13 billion in aid distributed across Western Europe between 1948 and 1952. The Federal Republic of Germany received $1.4 billion, less than Britain's $3.2 billion, or France's $2.7 billion, but still staggering in its implications. This wasn't reparations. This was investment. The former enemy was being invited to rebuild, not as a subordinate, but as a partner. Franz Blücher, who would later become vice-chancellor, remembered the moment he understood what was happening. It was late 1948 in the Rhine-Ruhr region where he was coordinating reconstruction. An American delegation had come to discuss industrial production targets. Blücher, trained in the old Prussian tradition, expected orders. Instead, they asked questions. What do you need? What are the bottlenecks? How can we help? I kept waiting for the conditions, Blücher wrote in his memoirs. The demands, the control. But they genuinely seemed to want us to succeed, not as puppets, as partners. I went home that night and couldn't sleep. My entire framework for understanding the world had been wrong. This cognitive dissonance, this gap between expectation and experience, was the true shock of the Marshall Plan. It wasn't just about the money or the materials. It was about what the aid represented, a fundamental rejection of the revenge narrative that had governed European politics for centuries. Hamburg, September 1948. Käthe Möller stood in line at the distribution center on Mönckebergstrasse, her two daughters beside her, ration cards clutched in small fists. The building had been a department store once. WWII, the pride of Hamburg, but British bombing had gutted it in 1943. Now it was a cavernous shell with a makeshift roof, its purpose reduced to the grim arithmetic of survival. The line moved slowly. It always moved slowly. Käthe had learned to bring a book, though she rarely read it. Mostly she watched her daughters, Greta, 8 years old, and Liesel, 6, and tried to remember when their faces had last been round with health rather than tight with hunger. Then she reached the front of the line, and the world shifted. The clerk was checking her card, nodding, marking quantities. Standard procedure. But the quantities weren't standard. A kilogram of flour, double the usual ration. Half a kilogram of sugar. Real sugar. Not the saccharine substitute they'd been choking down for months. Condensed milk. Chocolate. Actual chocolate. There must be a mistake, Käthe said. The clerk, a tired woman in her 50s, smiled slightly. No mistake. American aid shipment came in yesterday. New quotas. American. From the Marshall Plan. You haven't heard. Käthe had heard. Everyone had heard. But hearing and experiencing were different things. She stared at the items being loaded into her basket. More food than she'd seen in one place since before the war, and felt something strange and uncomfortable twist in her chest. Greta tugged at her sleeve. Mama, is it real? Yes, Liebchen, it's real. Outside, in the weak September sunshine, Käthe broke off a corner of the chocolate and gave each daughter a piece. She watched them savor it, eyes closed, expressions of pure, uncomplicated joy, and felt tears begin to track down her face. Her husband had died in Stalingrad. Her son was somewhere in a Soviet labor camp, if he was alive at all. Her apartment was 2 rooms in a building with no roof on the top floor, and they heated it by burning furniture they salvaged from bombed-out buildings. She had been raised to believe that Americans were materialistic barbarians, that Anglo-Saxons were cold and calculating, that Germany's enemies would grind them into dust given the chance. And here she was, feeding her children chocolate provided by those same enemies. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. To accept the gift meant accepting that everything she'd been taught, everything her husband had died believing, might have been a lie. It meant confronting the possibility that the propaganda had inverted reality, that the devils were behaving with more humanity than the heroes. But the chocolate was real. Her daughter's smiles were real, and slowly, bite by bite, the old framework was dissolving. By 1950, West Germany's industrial production had reached 75% of its 1938 levels. By 1951, it would surpass them. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, was beginning its ascent, and Germans could see the markers everywhere. New construction, full employment, wages that meant something again, shops with goods to sell, and they knew, everyone knew, where it had started. The Marshall Plan wasn't the only factor, of course. Ludwig Erhard's currency reforms, the Korean War boom, German ingenuity and work ethic, all played roles. But the American aid had been the foundation, the base layer that made everything else possible. This created a peculiar psychological situation. To acknowledge improvement was to acknowledge American generosity. To acknowledge American generosity was to confront the bankruptcy of Nazi ideology. To confront that bankruptcy was to examine one's own complicity, one's own choices, one's own past. Some chose denial, some chose selective memory, but many, perhaps most, chose transformation. Adenauer's office, Bonn, March 1951. Konrad Adenauer, the Federal Republic's first chancellor, was meeting with John McCloy, the American High Commissioner. The agenda was technical: industrial quotas, trade agreements, rearmament discussions. But Adenauer had something else on his mind. "You must understand," Adenauer said, speaking slowly in his careful English, "what your Marshall Plan has done. Not just economically, psychologically." McCloy waited. "My generation," Adenauer continued, "we remember Versailles. We remember the humiliation, the hunger, the resentment that grew into poison. When Germany fell in 45, we expected Versailles again, but worse. We expected revenge. We thought we deserved it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Instead, you gave us dignity. You gave us a chance to rebuild not as subjects, but as equals. You broke the cycle. Do you understand how rare that is? How historically unprecedented?" McCloy shifted in his chair. "We had practical reasons." "Of course," Adenauer interrupted gently. "Containing communism, stabilizing Europe, creating markets. I understand realpolitik. But the effect..." He gestured at the window, at the rebuilding city beyond. "The effect is that you've created a generation of Germans who don't hate you, who trust you, who see America not as a conqueror, but as a partner. That is not a small thing. We couldn't have another war," McCloy said simply. "No," Adenauer agreed. "But you chose the difficult path, the expensive path, the path that required faith that your former enemy could change. That was not inevitable. That was choice. And that choice has saved us." Regensburg, Christmas, 1952. Hans Dietrich limped through the Christmas market, his leg aching in the cold. The shrapnel wound had healed, but the scar tissue protested temperature changes. 7 years since the surgery. 7 years since Dr. Morrison's careful hands had saved not just his leg, but his life. The market was full, impossibly full. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts, mulled wine, hand-carved ornaments, toys for children. Real toys, not the wooden scraps that had passed for playthings in the lean years. The smells were intoxicating: cinnamon, cloves, pine, roasting meat. The lights strung between the stalls were electric, bright, prodigal with energy. Hans bought a small carved angel for his mother. She was 73 now, frail, but she'd survived. They'd all survived. He stood for a moment, watching families move through the market. Fathers carrying small children on their shoulders, mothers laughing, teenagers flirting awkwardly by the hot chocolate stand. Normal life, Boring, beautiful, normal life. A voice behind him. Hans Dietrich. He turned. It took a moment to place the face. Older now, filled out, but the eyes were the same. Klaus Hartmann? They'd served together, briefly, in the final chaotic months. Klaus had been captured 2 weeks before Hans, also wounded, also terrified. They embraced awkwardly, the German way, more backslapping than warmth. "You survived," Klaus said, grinning. "So did you." "American hospital," Klaus said. "They took out shrapnel from my chest. 3 pieces. The doctor said if I'd waited another hour, I'd have died from internal bleeding." Hans nodded slowly. "Me too. Femoral artery." They stood in silence for a moment. 2 men held together by a shared improbability. "Do you ever think about it?" Klaus asked finally. "About how they saved us?" "Every day," Hans said quietly. "Every single day. We were taught they were monsters. We were taught a lot of things." Another silence, this one heavier. "My son," Klaus said. "He's 8 now. I tell him stories about the war sometimes, about the Americans, about how they treated us. I want him to understand that people can be better than we expect, that enemies can become friends, that mercy is stronger than revenge." Hans looked at his friend. This man who had also been carried by enemy hands, who had also been saved by the incomprehensible generosity of the victor, and felt the weight of shared history. "Will he believe you?" Hans asked. Klaus smiled. "I show him the scar, physical proof. Sometimes that's what it takes, something undeniable, written on the body, to make us believe in grace." The Marshall Plan officially ended in December 1951, but its effects rippled outward for decades. By 1955, West German GDP had doubled. Unemployment had dropped from 12% to 4%. Per capita income was rising faster than any other European nation. The Wirtschaftswunder was in full bloom, but the economic statistics, impressive as they were, missed the deeper transformation. What the Marshall Plan had accomplished, what American policymakers perhaps hadn't fully anticipated, was a revolution in German consciousness. For the first time in modern history, Germany had been defeated and then invited to rise again with dignity, not as a vassal, not as a permanent subordinate, but as a partner in a new European order. This broke something fundamental in the German psyche. The wound and pride cycle, the oscillation between arrogance and humiliation that had characterized German nationalism since unification. The sociologist Ralph Dahrendorf, writing in the 1960s, called it liberation through defeat. Germany had been freed from the burden of its own worst impulses by losing the war, and then freed from the burden of vengeful occupation by American policy. The Marshall Plan became, in retrospect, the permission structure for Germany to become something different, not the militaristic power of tradition, but the democratic, prosperous, peaceful nation it would become. This wasn't automatic. It wasn't inevitable. It required thousands of individual transformations, people like Hans Dietrich and Käthe Müller and Klaus Hartmann, choosing day by day to accept the reality before their eyes, rather than the propaganda in their heads. It required the courage to admit that one's enemies might be more honorable than one's own leaders, that one's defeat might be one's salvation. Berlin, November 9, 1989. Hans Dietrich, 76 years old, sat in his small apartment in West Berlin and watched the television with tears streaming down his face. The wall was falling. People were dancing on it, hammering at it, embracing strangers from the east with the desperate joy of those who had been separated too long. His grandson Marcus sat beside him, confused by the old man's emotion. "Opa," the boy said, "why are you crying?" Hans struggled to speak. How do you explain to a child born in peace and prosperity what it means to see the final death of the world you were raised in? How do you convey the weight of living long enough to see your enemy become your friend, your defeat become your salvation, your darkest hour become the dawn? I'm crying, Hans said finally, because I lived to see this, because I got to watch the miracle unfold, because I was shown mercy when I deserved punishment, and that mercy changed everything. Marcus looked puzzled. He'd grown up in a Germany at peace, prosperous, democratic. He'd never known hunger or fear or defeat. To him, friendship with America was normal. The idea of Germany as a threat was absurd. He was, in essence, the product of the Marshall Plan's deepest success, a German who couldn't imagine being anyone's enemy. "Opa," he said, "tell me again about the American doctor." And Hans did. He told the story he'd told 100 times before, the mud, the fear, the certainty of death, and then the impossible kindness of strangers, the surgery, the clean hands, the word buddy spoken in broken German by a man who had every reason to hate him. "He saved your life," Marcus said, as he always did. "Yes," Hans agreed, "but more than that. He saved my belief that life could be different, that the cycle could be broken, that yesterday's enemy could be tomorrow's friend." He gestured at the television, where Germans from both sides were still celebrating in the streets. That, he said, started with mercy, with the choice to rebuild instead of revenge, with the Marshall Plan, with all those small acts of kindness that seemed impossible at the time. Outside, Berlin was celebrating its reunification. Inside, an old man who had once been an enemy soldier sat with his grandson and marveled at the long arc of history, how it bends sometimes toward grace. Epilogue. The anatomy of transformation. The Marshall Plan distributed approximately $13 billion across Western Europe between 1948 and 1952, about $130 billion in today's currency. The Federal Republic of Germany received roughly $1,400 million, or about 10% of the total. These numbers tell one story. But they miss the deeper narrative, the story of what happens when power chooses mercy over revenge, when the victor helps the vanquished stand, rather than grinding them into dust. For Germans who lived through it, the Marshall Plan was a mirror held up to propaganda. They had been taught that their enemies were monsters. Instead, they found human beings who fed their children, rebuilt their cities, saved their lives. They had been told that defeat meant destruction. Instead, they found partnership and possibility. This created what psychologists might call cognitive dissonance, an unbearable tension between belief and experience. And when such tension becomes unbearable, something has to change. Either you deny the experience, or you change the belief. Most chose the latter. Not easily, not quickly, but persistently. Over years and decades, the old framework dissolved under the weight of contrary evidence. The Anglo-Saxon devils became allies. The righteous cause became a catastrophic mistake. The glorious struggle became a cautionary tale. This is why elderly Germans still tear up when discussing the Marshall Plan. Not because of the money, not because of the food or the equipment or the rebuilt infrastructure, but because it represented something they had been taught to believe was impossible. That enemies could become friends, that mercy could be stronger than revenge, that the cycle of violence could actually be broken. Hans Dietrich died in 2003, at 90 years old. At his funeral, his family displayed a photograph they'd discovered only years before. A picture from April 1945, showing a young American surgeon named Morrison standing outside a field hospital, hands in pockets, looking tired. Someone had tracked down the doctor's service records and confirmed the date, the location, the operation that saved Hans's leg. Marcus, giving the eulogy, held up the photograph. "My grandfather used to say that this man, this enemy who became his savior, taught him the most important lesson of his life, that we are not doomed to repeat history's cycles, that grace is possible, that yesterday's opponent can be tomorrow's friend, that Mercy, more than revenge, has the power to transform the world. He paused, looking at the photograph. The Marshall Plan was announced as economic policy, but for people like my grandfather, it was something else. It was proof that change is possible, that people and nations can become better than we expect, that sometimes the bravest choice is to help your enemy stand. Outside the church, Berlin hummed with traffic and commerce and the comfortable noise of a city at peace. Inside, mourners listened and remembered, not just one man's life, but the larger story of how a defeated nation was given a second chance, how enemies became allies, how the unthinkable became reality. The scar on Hans's leg had faded over the decades, but it never disappeared entirely. A thin white line, barely visible, that testified to the moment when one man's mercy intersected with another man's survival. Physical proof, as Klaus Hartmann had said all those years ago in the Christmas market, that grace is real. Sometimes that's what it takes. Something undeniable, written on the body or woven into history, to make us believe that the world can be better than we imagine.